Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Rock and Roll Religion, where we got a bit of a different band for you today. We are talking about maybe not the heaviest band in the world, but they did have some pretty metallic leanings, and they would also influence a lot of bands going forward from this point. And they were also around in that formative mid 70s period where, what was metal and what wasn't was still kind of being defined, and they were kind of walking that line their entire career. Not the most prolific band ever, but one of the most influential. And when they did come out with music, it was fantastic. We are talking about the legendary Boston, a band I have a actual personal connection to, as well as being from my area. And also, one of my favorite like prog rock bands of all time. I would put them up there with a whole bunch of the big boys in terms of what they were experimenting with musically and how successful they were with it. And, speaking of classics from the 70s, to help me talk about this topic, we have friend of the show and longtime guest, that 70s rock fan. How's it going, my dude?
All right, mate. Yeah, I laughed out loud when you said that. A relic from the 60s, to be honest.
But, that's fair. But you didn't really gain popularity until the 70s.
That's right. I didn't get above 3 feet tall until the 70s, yeah. So I got my 99 pence 12-inch single of Don't Look Back Here.
Nice.
Yes, as well. I mean, I do have the first two albums on vinyl too, which this one is in my 12-inch single collection. I was a big fan of 12-inch singles when I bought vinyl.
Yeah, no, well, 12-inch single's kind of interesting because it's the size of an LP.
Yeah, and you could probably usually get extra tracks on them or special extended versions.
Although I don't really know what the selling point would be, because the whole point with 45s was they were like these nice, cute little things you could put in like a biscuit tin or whatever. And
the selling point was suckers like me would buy them.
Yeah, I guess true. That's the same reason they're coming up with vinyl records again now.
Yeah,
because idiots will buy them. Hello.
Indeed. So hail Soul Assassin, Lord Thoth, and
how's it
Papa
going,
Cotton.
guys? And yes, Soul Assassin, there is some favoritism in there, but I have good reason for it, which we'll get to.
Anyway, thank you for having me, mate.
Absolutely.
This is in my wheelhouse, Boston. Now we're talking my core belief system.
Well, not only that, 70s rock fan. It's 70s rock. We're here.
Exactly. This was my air guitar favorite in More Than a Feeling in 1976 or whatever it was. I played air guitar to that so many times.
And they're loosely associated with a guy you're going to have on the show tomorrow, or in terms of their music.
Yeah, there's a certain certainly of the same era. So Graham Bonnet, of course, is tomorrow's guest. Assuming there are no last minute changes, touch wood. So I don't know if, undoubtedly, especially during the Rainbow era, their paths may have crossed many times. And both at that Rainbow at that time and Boston were practitioners of, I don't know what you would describe it as, but I'd probably call it melodic guitar-based rock.
It's definitely prog rock, and would kind of be more towards the power metal side of the house.
Yeah, there's
prog. That more symphonic element to them.
Yeah, the symphonic bit's interesting. There's prog leanings, although some people would describe it, probably Boston first two albums, particularly as straight ahead, guitar-based, rock. The keyboard stuff, Hammond organ work, a lot of it, and extended pieces like Long Time and whatever. You're right. There's prog leanings in there,
along with some pretty heavy elements there in a lot of the riffs and stuff like that. A lot of power chords, a lot of interesting stuff like that. And a lot of that soaring vocal that would come to dominate heavy and power metal later on. So they've got elements of all of it. And yes, Fizz, these guys are named after the city, and they're not the only one. There's also
they were named after
Chicago.
I thought they were named after a pizza chain. Boston Pizza. I guess, Tom Scholz was at MIT, and that's in Boston, isn't it?
Yep. And the entire band is from the area. In
Yeah,
fact,
well, I mean, not every. It's not. I don't like everything about them. That's one of the things I don't like about them. I'm just kidding.
but the personal connection I have with the band is my father actually went to high school with Brad Delp.
All right, and sadly departed Brad Delp. Yeah,
Yeah,
well, that's nice
unfortunate.
though. So it's a
That
pity
one
he
came out
wasn't
of
in the
left field
band.
too, because he was doing really well and had his own thing going with other artists and stuff like that. And then,
Pretty young, wasn't he? Really? I mean,
yeah, I want to say
40s, maybe.
late 50s, early 60s.
All right, was he as old as that? Yeah, still pretty young.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's quite sad. But because vocals often overlooked, I guess. I'm a guitar guy. I love the sound of guitars. Vocals are often overlooked, but as you said, the soaring vocal work.
in this band, the vocals are kind of hard to ignore because they're one of the major pieces of the band, and they really highlight a lot of it. In a lot of their songs.
Yeah, there's a lot of like the guitars were overlaid. There's a lot of overlaid vocals too, and vocal harmonies. And I think like you mentioned, the track "Long Time." When it hits the certain points of that, there's probably I don't know how many like Queen, like we mentioned Queen before the show started. How many multi-tracked vocals on there, and it just soars as a result.
Yeah, and I remember seeing interviews with Queen on a couple of their albums, talking like Roger Deacon talking about like how like the film when it was be going back through the recorder is like there's nothing left of
It's
it.
disappearing. Yeah, the magnetic.
It's almost transparent. There's just nothing left of it.
Let's do another overdub.
Yeah, and like they basically abused that technology for all it was worth.
Yeah, I mean Schultz, I think ended up because he did a lot of this in his home studio, ended up almost creating a lot of technology, given he was a wizard, just to help with that process. You know, like in order to do this beautifully polished, intricate, multi-layered stuff, he came up with devices like we talked about again. You and I were talking about before the show. The Rockman was all his work, just so he could press a button instead of having to do 20 overdubs.
Yeah, instead of having to change like 20 settings on his amp, he can just hit a button and it'll do it. But I think that's also one of the things that stands them apart is not only his guitar playing, but the way they were recording and his methodology and technology that he was using or inventing at the time that wouldn't be used by other bands until over a decade later.
Yeah. There's I guess the word you could use, and it's funny they're not talked about as much this band as many others of the era. You could use a seminal. So much stuff has grown off them.
Whether the people who are influenced by them even know that or not,
would even acknowledge it. Would even acknowledge it. Yes.
Would even acknowledge it, or even know that's where it came from.
But a bunch of AOR acts, particularly in the 80s, we owe everything, I think, to Boston, whether they would acknowledge it or even whether they sound like them particularly or not. I mean, bands like Journey and a lot of other bands like that, I think, yes, they'd recorded before in themselves in the 70s, a lot of the stuff in the 70s. I think they took a lot of inspiration from Boston and their approach. So,
well, I think that's part of the reason so many bands and albums from this mid 70s period became such classics and are, still talked about to this day was the technology at work here was changing so fast that, everybody was just experimenting constantly with new sounds that they couldn't have done 10 years ago or had the idea of, but didn't know how to record it. And then all of a sudden it's available.
Well, there's the prog bit you mentioned again. Yeah, I mean, these guys, although you never say they sounded like a Yes or a Genesis or an ELP, they were using the same big process to record. This is we're not just knocking this stuff off in an afternoon.
Yeah, this took months worth of work, and again, the same mental process of, well, just because no one's ever done it before, does that mean that you can't do it, or is it that nobody has?
Yeah. And that sound in your head, it must have been in Tom Schultz's head, that guitar sound, that signature, almost like, because obviously people love twin guitar things like Thin Lizzy or Judas Priest. This took this to the nth level. with those fantastic Gibson, mainly Gibson Les Paul
Yep.
melodic guitar riffs layered upon each other with a particularly sweet but fuzzy sound.
Yeah, and that guitar tone, it almost sounds like something that Schultz had to have been like, I'll know it when I hear it, and just played around with every setting on his entire sound chain until he found it.
And I know that More Than a Feeling is, played to death, has been ever since then. But when you listen to the guitar riffs in that, the bits without the vocals, the dun, 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 it just cuts right through you and makes you go, ooh.
And like you say, More Than a Feeling is overplayed to death, but there's a reason for that. It's one of those songs that's overplayed because it's amazing, not just because it's overrated.
Yeah, we forget just how good it really is, and when you sit and listen to it with headphones on again, you go, okay, I remember now.
Yeah, and we'll get into the first album with that.
The first album is just, I mean, it's got to be in the top 50 of all time, if not, some people would put it way higher than that. I mean, I could see people saying this is my favorite album of all time. I could see that,
I could easily justify that. And everything about this album is just iconic, from the sound of it to the art to...
I love the cover, yeah.
Oh, I love all three of their covers. Like, they had some really cool album art from beginning to end.
Kind of ELO-ish in a little
it's like
way.
you're a rock band. You're a rock band teasing me with sci-fi cover art.
Yeah,
I'm in.
It is. I was completely in because I'm a huge sci-fi fan. So regardless of the music, I just loved that cover too.
And if Dan's done a cover of More Than a Feeling, I would love to hear it. I'll have to look that up after the show because I think he could do an amazing job of it.
Yeah,
he certainly has the voice for it.
Yeah, but this is an album that a lot of the time now we just play individual tracks.
Yeah.
We can't help it. I mean, we've just got so much stuff, and you go, oh yeah, I want to play that track. I want to play that track. This is an album I rarely listen to without playing the whole album from start to finish in order.
Yeah, I'll say that I don't have anything off of this album saved to a playlist on Spotify. I'll just go find the album and play it.
It's got to be the whole album from beginning to finish, right? From
and they're not long records either. I think this one's only like 38 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's 4 tracks each side or something. And
yeah,
I may be wrong on that, of course, because I've got a terrible memory and I'm old. No, there's more. There's 11 tracks. No, 11 tracks. Three tracks on side 1, 8 on side. No, that's wrong. There's only 8 tracks. I was right. Sorry, my mental arithmetic is shit. There's only 8 tracks, 3 and 5. 1735 in side 1, 1932 in side 2. So that's 37 minutes long.
Yeah. So and it doesn't feel it. You get the feeling of a full, complete piece in those 37 minutes.
I think you have to listen to it as a whole. Like, that's why
they do form parts of a whole. All 3 albums are like this, by the way, where you'll get songs on the follow-up albums that don't make any sense if you don't listen to the whole record.
Yeah, they just seem to fit. Even if they don't fit thematically, they fit sound-wise, pacing-wise. The only thing I would have suggested, possibly, if I was to be banding the album, as they used to call it, is I would have considered putting Foreplay and Long Time at the very beginning. More Than a Feeling.
I can see an argument either way there. I don't know that I would disagree with that, but More Than a Feeling is that big hook that gets people into the record.
Well, that's why they
put it Foreplay kind of takes a little bit of time to get started.
It just feels like an introduction to something because it is. It's that
it does, quiet keyboard. I believe it's the intro to side B.
It was a third, wasn't it? The third track inside,
or is it? I think it's the fourth.
I seem to recall it was track 3, side 1, and it finished side 1, but I might be wrong because they may
have done it a different way, where they had the 2 real pop hits with Peace of Mind and More Than a Feeling on side A, and then led that as the intro into side B.
Yeah. Sure, and then maybe I mean, also when you came to cassettes, they may have rejigged it, and because I had a cassette of it.
Well, that's the thing is when you start talking about albums that like I would have in the 2000s or whatever, it can be completely different from what was actually released.
Yeah, because I always seem to recall hearing in my head foreplay first, so maybe I've got them rejigged the
Maybe.
tracks so that they
I
do
could be
that.
wrong.
But I think you're right. More Than a Feeling kicked it off, and
Oh, I mean that was the first track, and then Peace of Mind follows up, which that 1-2 punch. Like if you were listening to that when it first came out, you're sold right there.
oh, I was. I mean, I was in absolute heaven when I heard this, and whilst I did like a lot of heavy stuff. I like just rock in general, and I loved the fact that this had some real crunch to it in places, but it also sounded a bit like the Eagles and a bit like Foghat and a bit like Fleetwood Mac and a bit like there was a melodic side to it.
Yeah, there was a lot of different sounds at play here. Like you had a lot of 50s rock and roll and a lot of the composition and writing of it. You had a lot of heavy metal and a lot of some of the guitar tone and a lot of power chords and stuff like that. And you had a lot of other musical styles and a lot of synthesizer coming in to add into that process. And what you end up is this prog rock masterpiece coming out in the mid 70s.
Yeah, I guess you could call it almost prog pop rock in a sense.
Yeah, a little bit, because it was kind of experimenting with all of that.
Yeah, without ever losing an entirely commercial edge. It's so hard to do. It's hard to be commercial and progressive at the same time.
Yeah, like this is one of those weird albums that pleases the record label, the fans, and the music nerds all in one.
Yeah.
Which is almost impossible to do.
It is really
usually the albums the fans really like don't sell well.
Yeah,
the ones the record label really likes, the fans despise.
But I think it's, I mean, I would say it was a seminal album in what you could call mainstream American rock. Almost also inspiring, I would say, a lot of power pop stuff. You know, a lot of guys like Cheap Trick, and then way later guys like Tom Petty and others would have taken a lot from an album like this.
I can easily see that. Probably even a little bit of Blue Oyster Cult and stuff like that. They were kind of in this weird no man's land between metal and rock too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic equivalent. And I think if you looked at 80s American pop rock and hard rock, you can draw an awful lot of lines from this album in 1976 that say 4 years later, here's the fruits of that from guys who were teenagers listening to it and then started making their own records.
And I think it's the follow-up to this one. And it may be, the presence of Eddie Van Halen and stuff like that, but you can kind of hear a lot of similar things coming out of Tom and Eddie. Even on this record, I've noticed that Tom has a habit of in his phrasing where he'll flourish by just using a quick little hammer-on to emphasize a note. And I love that because it's something I tend to do as well. And that's probably where I learned it.
I tend to play with an actual hammer. It makes yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's just I'd forgotten until you said you were going to talk about Boston Today, just how important I think they were, and particularly for the American sound in the 80s.
And especially for a band that produced as little actual music as these guys did. Like they only have 3 records, and one of them took a decade to come out.
Well, I guess this one took a long time too, because apparently he started working on it in something like 1970.
Which is interesting because that means that they were doing this when they were still in high school.
Yeah, Tom Schultz had started attending MIT in the very late 60s. First started writing music, and he was in various bands. And he that's when the genesis of this album really came about.
And you can hear it a little bit. Like it's got that heaviness of a lot of what we were talking about the last time you were on with that late 60s psychedelic and rise of hard rock era stuff like Uriah Heep and Deep Purple and all that stuff. But it's also got a lot of the synth and experimental elements from that period too.
Yeah, I mean, reading, whether it can be trusted or not, reading some of the stuff on Wikipedia about the band, him and the drummer, Jim Madsia, shared a similar concept at the time, which was crystal clear vocals and bone crunching guitars. So that makes a lot of sense when you hear them say that, because that's kind of what you ended up with.
Yeah, I mean, it's and when you look at it, that's basically power metal in a nutshell. Is you
Yeah.
get that really crisp, clear vocal, but you also get that bone crunching guitar work.
Yeah, so I think you're right. There's a big power metal inspiration
Especially
component
because two
to
of the other main influences at this point in the early 70s would be Queen and later at the same time as these guys, Rainbow.
Yeah, because Queen could do that sound too. The fantastic vocals, but absolutely bone crunching rock.
And even in terms of
Guitars.
lyrical content, two of the obviously Rainbow and Queen both went more with the fantasy side of like the power metal kind of lyrical mindset, but these guys went more with the sci-fi aesthetic.
They did, yeah.
Which
yeah.
Almost no one would put them in these categories, but they're certainly a progenitor of it.
Well, another
before
thing
it
they
was
have in
called.
common with Blue Oyster Cult, then, yeah, which you mentioned.
Yeah, well, Blue Oyster Cult's considered a very much a power metal influence as well,
And
because they talked
spacey.
about a lot of shit.
Yeah, Space Age too. But they had the demos already. You know, they had a little home studio, Schultz and Mazdia, and they had the demos of most of these songs done by 73, 74. So they had been working on this for quite some time. So that makes them even further ahead of their time, I think.
Yeah. And in terms of, people at these record labels, everyone assumes like, oh, well, they know what they're doing. They must be good at their jobs and determining what's going to sell and what isn't. Nobody wanted this record. No record label wanted to sign them or produce this record. So they did it themselves. And I forget how many records this has sold, but it's something in the realm of like 15 million.
Oh God, must be at least. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than that. I mean, I don't have any. I'm looking for figures on it, but
it must be an absolutely insane number.
It
goes to show you what the record execs know.
And that was global. I mean, I say global. Certainly, it was big in Britain. I mean, I remember this.
Yeah, these guys came out of the gate and immediately hit it off worldwide.
Yeah,
which is not always the case for most people.
Not always the case. No, I mean, sometimes that stuff takes doesn't transfer over the Atlantic, for instance. But this album and More Than a Feeling was huge in the UK, which is why I heard it, of course. And I went, "Oh, what's that?" First time I heard More Than a Feeling. Hairs in the back of the neck go up when you hear it for the first time. I wish I could go back.
That's
and recall
one of those songs too that like you almost wonder what the feeling was in the studio after they recorded that, where if they knew what they had on their hands or not.
I would imagine there was some level of satisfaction when it was finally.
But it's one of those moments you're like, are they all sitting there like, this is going to be like the next big thing that people are still going to be talking about decades from now? Or was that, oh yeah, that's a good take. We'll work with that and see what we can do with it.
You got to wonder, and I always love that when bands say, you know what, we think we nailed it. We just sat there in the studio and played it again and again and again. And they probably did. Let's face it took them a long time to work on anything else, so they weren't in a hurry.
No, I think they figured it was going to be a hit, but I don't think they figured it was going to blow up anywhere near what it did.
Yeah, hence their scramble to get a live unit together to go out and promote it.
Yeah.
Because they only had the bare bones of that, and Delp had been in and out and had gone and then came back again.
Yeah, that's true, Davina. Foreigner has a lot of these hallmarks as well later in the 70s.
That's an interesting one because Foreigner's first album was in 1976 as well. So it's possible their later evolution was heavily influenced by this. I think their initial stuff might not have been.
That's also the cool part too in the 70s, where like we were talking about in the mid 60s, where rock and roll had gone over to England and then had come back, and then from like 67 on, it's almost evolving on both sides of the Atlantic in real time.
Absolutely, and I think what we were saying earlier is you didn't have to sound like Boston particularly to be influenced by them. So that's where bands like Foreigner and Journey Blue Oyster Cult, even right down to your Starships and whatever. The Boston opened up that arena rock avenue for these bands and showed them the potential of that sound. It wasn't just your Led Zeppelins that could fill an arena or your Rolling Stones. There was a whole strand of stuff like Boston and those bands that could do it too.
Yeah, and there was so many different types of rock in the 70s that were doing this, and were all popular, like from the Southern rock genre to, a lot of folk stuff like John Mellencamp and stuff like that, to these guys, to the rise of metal. It's like there was, if you were
Beautiful
a rock
time.
fan, if you were a rock fan in the 1970s, like you had everything you could have ever wanted.
I know, and a lot of people are a bit poo-poo in the 70s. Like, oh, well, the 70s was boring. It was all just prog guys and blah, blah, blah. That's absolute bullshit, and it always has been bullshit. As you say, you had everything. I mean, look at some of these gigs festivals you could go to in the mid-70s, like the California Jam or whatever. Look at the lineups and the variety of
like some of those magical lineups I've ever seen. Like,
yeah. Well, you'd get the Eagles and Deep Purple on the same bill, or you'd get, just an incredible variety of stuff. The Southern rock bands on the same bill.
And it was a little looser too. Like it's less like it is now where they would have a tour and a whole bunch of them would meet up for these festivals. But in the meantime, like they're touring with these people constantly.
Yeah.
If another band's in the area, like say Black Sabbath happened to be in area for California Jam or whatever, they'd show up and probably get to play.
Yeah, it was just a really fertile time for rock fans, I believe. I mean, others say, oh, God, no, the 60s were great, and then they had punk was great, but the bit in between was, no, bullshit. That's snobbish garbage.
Yeah.
There was so much good stuff, and Boston was right in the middle of it, 1976. It wasn't even...
That's a great way to put that. It's a musical candy store. Pretty much no matter what you're into, it's there.
Yeah. I mean... This is such a good album. It's one of those albums that does not age. It
really doesn't.
Fresh today.
If you played this for someone who's never been introduced to this era of music before, they'd probably think it's modern.
Yeah, it does. It sounds as good today as it did then. You wouldn't know when it had been recorded. It's absolutely
and I will say that about a
pristine.
lot of rock bands is that they sound like they were recorded in the 70s.
Yeah. This one's different. I mean, I listen to it now and it's as fresh sounding as ever.
And that's even some bands I love. Like I love a lot of early Priest stuff, but a lot of their early recordings sound very flat. Like it doesn't have a lot of depth to the sound and all that. Like the bass is barely audible.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, but that's because it was recorded in 1976 in a not so great studio.
Probably recorded in Britain where they didn't know what bass was half the time.
Pretty much.
British studios like to downplay the bass. The American ones like to push it up.
Yeah, and that actually, surprisingly, in my brain, now that I'm putting those riffs side by side, that actually would fit quite well. Soul Assassin.
I think it would. I mean, that's the beauty
got like
of it.
Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath era, Black Sabbath, or with Boston opening. I could actually see that.
I know. I mean, I would go gaga for a lineup like that. I would just, I mean, and that I think most rock fans loved it. There might have been purists who went, oh no, I don't like that Boston melodic crap. I don't think so. I think you would have gone nuts for lineups like that. Imagine.
And when they say that, well, Sabbath was pretty melodic at points too.
Well, melodic in the same way that having your skull crushed in by a hammer is melodic. I'm just kidding. Tony Iommi, deceptively melodic indeed. Absolutely. Everyone thinks of Sabbath because of the sort of doom metal stuff, but there's a lot of melody in there. There's a lot of great melodic hooks. There's classical influences, folk influences. It's all pretty much in there. You just have to hear it.
And Davina, you're right. This was the era in the going into the 60s where up until then you couldn't really record in anything other than a full band. Like, so you would have like one microphone for the singer and one mic in the ceiling for the rest of the band. And with the advent of like multi-track recording, then you could actually record each individual artist separately and then mix it in.
Some bands, it was just to stop them from fighting.
That too.
So did the Grateful Dead record in dead rooms?
Probably. I mean, there's probably dead people in some of the rooms they recorded in.
Yeah. Well, they weren't dead when they went in, but they might have been when they came out. That guy hasn't moved for 3 days. So yeah, what an album! Just every track is brilliant, and there's sort of heavy stuff. There's pop stuff.
It really is
catchy.
And then Don't Look Back is kind of a continuation of that.
Yeah, it's probably 90% as good. It's nothing could match the brilliance of the original, but as a follow-up, pretty damn fucking good. I mean,
unfortunately, when your first album is as good as that is, there's almost nowhere to go but down.
It's always hard to recapture lightning, but I do think there's also a progressive element on this, which is great, which is like the Journey. Things like the Journey are progressive type.
And they're starting to toy around with almost a concept album of like kind of telling a story with the different tracks.
Yeah, I mean the signature sound is there's a bit of a story in this. Signature sound is still there. I think there's Beatle-esque touches in certain places. There's orchestral guitars. I mean, there's an orchestral element to it. It's a brilliant album. I mean, if this was the debut album, it would still be considered a classic.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's still. I mean, Don't Look Back itself is right up there with some of their best.
Yeah,
and there's some other stuff on here, like Feeling Satisfied. Like every time I hear that guitar riff, I just freaking love it.
It makes me smile.
Yeah, it's one of those. Like, it doesn't have to be the heaviest thing ever, but when you hear half of these songs, you're just kind of nodding your head and just like, yeah, I like that.
It's beautiful, and also you've got some pretty heavy stuff like Don't Be Afraid.
Yep.
At the end, that comes to a really heavy ending. I think it's Used to Be Bad News, lovely track.
Yeah.
A Man I'll Never Be. I never listen to these individually. I listen to the whole album, usually after I've listened to the first one.
And that's another box for me ticked off, that they're more an influence on power metal than we think they are, because that's something that power metal would be famous for, is the concept album. And also having themes that are connected throughout the songs. And these guys are doing that throughout multiple different albums too.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to put these two albums together as a double album, nothing would be out of place. There isn't a bad track.
No, there really isn't. Like I listened to all three of these right before the show, and I really can't pick out one that I wouldn't put on the record that isn't like an instrumental that leads into something else.
Yeah, and there's a couple of those. But yeah, I mean, it's all in there. Hard rock, progressive, pop rock, everything's in there.
And I love how even the album art is connected all the way through.
Yeah.
Where you've got that same guitar-shaped spaceship. I love it.
Yeah, with what I'm assuming is meant to be the city of Boston.
Yeah, Boston doesn't have that distinctive a skyline, so it's hard to tell.
Like yeah, it's kind of weird. Could just
it's
be a city.
It's a city in a snow globe.
It's just a city.
Yeah, pretty much. But no, overall, pretty interesting second album, and really, and it's weird that these guys. There was a lot of interpersonal issues with the band, it feels like, and also I think they needed this long to really get the next idea done, almost like Blizzard, but releasing video games. But it would take another, because this was 1978. So, and Soul Assassin, their art style kind of reminds me of heavy metal a little bit.
Well, it's
got that kind of animated quality to it.
So that's very much of its era then. It's a zeitgeist.
Yeah, because this is 78 and that was 81. So,
but I would have to speculate that a guy like Schultz and the rest of the guys in the band were possibly into stuff like heavy metal, the comic.
Well, they released a Christmas compilation under the Boston name in 2013 called "God Rest Ye Metal Gentlemen."
Yeah, so I've got to imagine being 70s university guys, and then
So I think it's a very similar situation to Queen, where you had Freddie, who was the more pop and jazz guy, and
yeah,
then you had Brian, who is the who's the real rock and metal guy, who just wants
yeah.
to go as hard and heavy as he can. And you
I,
can
I,
see
I
that in certain tracks, especially in early,
hadn't thought of
um,
that, but
like
that's that.
in early Queen albums, where every now and again you'll just get that hard ass riff coming out of Brian.
Yeah, you
It kind of
will.
sounds out of place, but it's just like, okay, they gave him that one.
Well, the
Let him
first
play.
2 or 3 albums, particularly, yes, yeah,
Yeah, songs like Great King Rat and stuff like that, where it's just like, where
yeah.
did that come from?
It's a real dirty, gritty guitar on those.
Yep.
Yeah. Plus
It's the same
that,
thing with this. A lot of it's acoustic, a lot of it's very melodic and stuff like that. And every now and again, you'll just get that hard power chord out of it. You're just like, whoa, okay. So they
well,
let Tom out of his box.
yeah, and then you'll get stuck into like It's Easy, and it sounds like you're sort of full on boogie,
Yeah.
good time rock and roll,
Yeah. Which is, again, they do all of that well.
Mm.
It's not even like they try to pull off a 50s rock tune and it doesn't really work for them or whatever. Like, they kill it.
They do. It's a great couple of albums. I
And
know
then
they're
we move into the weird one of the group, but it's still a very good album. But it would take almost a decade for them to release it, being
I
Third
know,
Stage.
and a little bit too long, I think. I mean, some momentum was lost.
And I
I
think a
believe.
lot of it was musical taste by 1986 had changed completely.
Mm.
And if you notice, most of the prog rock bands weren't really doing the same things they were in 78 that they were now.
Well, by now, I mean, you'd had the entire punk new wave alternative thing. Metal was doing different stuff. Boston may have been seen as a little bit quaint and a product of the 70s.
Yeah,
Because we're
well, I
talking
think their
86
sound
now.
hadn't evolved much in that time because they were working on it that whole time.
Mm.
But it was still the same idea. And
Yeah,
unfortunately for them, they went from being cutting edge to everyone having passed them because they didn't come out with
exactly. Everyone
anything.
overtook them like this. Yeah. Although it's ironic then that they had possibly their second biggest hit single ever on Amanda, which everybody
Yeah.
loves and plays to this day.
Oh, it's a great song.
So, yeah, I mean, commercially, it was not. It wasn't off the mark. It felt it took a little bit too long for me. I was thinking, oh my god, I thought these guys were dead. They're still around.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh wait, Boston came back. Okay.
Yeah, is this like a reunion or something? No, they never went away. They were.
Like, yeah, they were still touring that whole time. Essentially,
Yeah.
they just hadn't done an album.
Yeah,
So it was like when
know,
Tool took that break in the mid 2000s. There, where everyone's like, "Are you guys ever coming out with a new record?" Like, "Oh yeah, we're working on it."
So this is the album that Schultz had finally got tired of doing all that multi-layering,
Yeah, and
multi-track
he just kind
layering.
of went back to the roots.
So
of it.
well, he invented the Rockman guitar box, so you could just press a couple of buttons to get that
Yeah.
Boston sound, which is the Rockman. We were talking about that. It's like that headset-based guitar effects thing.
We were talking about the ELO album covers. This is pretty similar. Although in that
Yeah.
case, they would have been influenced by ELO.
I
'cause
tell
that
you
came
what,
out
this
in, like,
also
82.
reminds me of ZZ Top's Afterburner
Yeah,
cover and the whole Rough Boy thing with the space. It
Yep.
looks very much like that too, I think.
which
But
I got to
that's-
get to them at some point.
I gotta do a full show on those someday.
I mean, I'm kind of in a blues rock mood these days. So like, I've been thinking we were going to cover George Thorogood last Sunday, but things happen. And then I'm thinking ZZ Top might be in the cards in the near future here too.
Oh, what a band! What a band! They're in my top handful of bands of all time, favorite bands. I'm so lucky, glad that I finally got to see them a few times in concert. I wish I'd seen them before I did. Like, I wish I'd seen them in the. I mean, I wasn't seeing that much stuff in the 70s. I was too young, or the early 80s. If I'd seen some of those tours in 80, 81 where they just ripped it up. Go look up the YouTube video of them opening. I think it's like the 81, 82 tour where they play I Thank You. as the opener, and it opens with the mariachi music and the flames on stage, and then it clears and they start that riff for I Thank You. Dun, 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 dun,
I
dun,
always
dun,
love
and
that.
it just and then they do the hopping forward thing with the guitars. They got the big hats on, the gold lamy suits.
And that's half of ZZ Top's performance is just the presence of ZZ Top.
Yeah. So I've never seen Boston live. I mean, they did some pretty big tours and big gigs. I'm not sure how effective. I mean, I'd have to talk to somebody that saw them live. Was it as effective live? Because there was obviously
I
some
can see
intricate
these
music.
guys not being a very good live act because that sounds hard to replicate
That's what I was
in
wondering.
real time.
Yeah, not to do them down as musicians on stage, but it's hard to recreate that stuff.
Yeah, unless you have like 15 other musicians behind the stage just making shit work in the background, you're never going to get that multi-layered sound out of it, which is what made it cool.
Yeah. And I would imagine I would always kind of felt slightly disappointed if it didn't sound like that. I know that's horrible because live is meant. I don't think it was music that was intended to be done live to start with. That's the problem.
No, it was never meant to be like a live composition. It was just meant to be like a musical piece.
Almost
And
like
he even has
orchestral
quite a
pieces.
bit on the back cover about it. So it took nearly 6 years to conceive and complete this album. No orchestral instruments or synthesizers were used to create the sound.
No synths, yeah. And that's
So
again, that's
you're
like
hearing on
Queen.
this record is them.
Very like Queen too. No
Yep.
synthesizers was their thing right up until 1984 or so. No synthesizers. 1980, sorry. The Game was the first album. But up till that point, we did it all without synths, just voices and guitars. Yeah. So
I like the progression of this record too, where it's kind of like this guy falling in love and going through all the stages of a relationship, and then they kind of don't tell you what happens. And then track 11, he has another girl's name in there.
Yeah,
so it's like, oh,
bastard.
Well, we know what happened here.
Yeah, it's kind of a concept album. I mean, you can see the tracks are almost like taking off. Maybe is it comparing a relationship to a spacecraft?
Well, that's the cool thing is they have this duality on this record and the one before of kind of not only talking about relationships and stuff like that, but also and using it in science fiction terms and stuff like that. So it's a really cool way of going about it.
Perhaps he's comparing his love for her to a Saturn V rocket. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Talk about afterburners. So
hopefully it doesn't burn after. That would be a bad sign.
Yeah, I mean, it's a creditable album. It's not one I play that often. I mean, not because I dislike it. There's so much stuff, and I tend to focus on the first two albums.
Yeah, it lives in the shadow of the first two for sure.
It does. It's a little bit darker than the other.
It's a little bit less coherent in terms of the sound.
Yeah.
Not that that's a bad thing. Like I think it works as a piece, but it is much less consistent as a record than it is or than anything else is.
Yeah.
That being said, even things on here that are absolute classics like Amanda, Cool the Engines, stuff like that. It's great.
Cool the Engines is a good track. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think it's something that takes that long is you maybe lose something in the process. You kind of lose sight of what you started out to do. A
little bit,
maybe.
I think, and also you start to lose focus on what this started out as, and you're just kind of bouncing ideas off of each other, and it is whatever monstrosity it turns into at that point. When you lose sight of your original goal, in writing it,
and was mid-80s, was it really the era for what? Because this is probably their most progressive album. Was it really the era for that?
Yeah, I think they missed the window on that by about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, even the prog rock bands of yesteryear were now really having pop hits like Yes and Genesis. And
yeah, there was two ways you could go in the prog rock era. Like you kind of went like the way Rush did and went more towards the metal side of the house and did a lot of harder stuff, or you went the way like Genesis and Yes did and became pretty much a pop
band. Pop bands. Yeah, exactly.
anyone who stayed in that middle ground was kind of just left by the wayside.
Yeah, because I'm struggling to think of another album in 1986 that would have sounded or felt or looked like this.
As much as I hate to rip on them that much, I guess that had a lot of synth on it, and this doesn't. But I was going to say Turbo by Judas Priest had a lot of very interesting prog elements into it.
It did, possibly their most prog album.
Yeah, and that's why I still enjoy it, even though a lot of people shit on it.
I don't mind it at all. I've never understood the hate for it. I get it. Every band wants to try something a little bit different. You don't want to be the same. Well, unless you're Motorhead, you don't want to be the same thing again and again.
I was going to say, in their case, you just.
Even they did a little bit of different stuff with 1916.
Well, that's the same. That was the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, they just sound the same. It's like, no, Lemmy sounds the same.
That's right, yeah. But yeah, there's no. I think in '86 it would be hard to think of another band that had an album like this. I might be missing something, but I can't.
Well, in general, it's hard to think of another band that created albums like this because they were very unique in their sound. Queen kind of comes close with like It's a Kind of Magic.
And some prior ELO stuff may have touched on it a little bit, not as heavy in the guitar side most of the time, but yeah, I think you've
in terms of prog stuff, maybe Blue Oyster Cult, but that would have been years before.
But that would have been like we're talking late 70s, early 80s. They'd really
with like Veteran of the Psychic Wars and stuff like that.
No, I think this album's pretty unique for its time. I mean, given it was surrounded by pop, new wave stuff, haircut bands, still the rise of blues guys like Stevie Ray Vaughan were big.
True.
There wasn't an album like this, so good fair play to them for sticking to their guns, so to speak.
Absolutely.
It doesn't copy anybody. That's one thing about Boston. Maybe it influences. They don't copy anybody. That was their sound.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we both have to go. So
we do. I'm afraid.
Fortunately, we got through all of the albums from this band that really matter. They do have Walk On in 1994, but it's nowhere near what these three are.
No, it's very different beast.
Again, not the greatest band ever made, but one of the most unique and certainly very influential in terms of both technology and sound throughout the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I think the first album will still be getting played. It's one of these albums, it'll still be getting played decades from now.
That's one of those ones that's going to go into like surpass like even just rock legend and is going to go into the collective memory of mankind.
I think so. It's possibly going to be regarded as one of these things. It's the classical, like if rock is the classical music of our era, then
they're going to be up there with Bach and Beethoven and all that.
Right.
Right up there with Crazy Train, We Will Rock You, all this other stuff. Like it's going to be right up the Final Countdown. As much as Imperatus is probably going to beat me backstage for that one.
He should beat you savagely for that one.
It is true, but it may be heresy, but it's true. I mean, it's going to be up there.
That first Boston album, I know I'll be playing it till the end of my time, which hopefully will still be a while away. But
and I fully agree. And Soul Assassin, the channel mascot, is doing really well. He just turned 12 weeks old a couple of days ago, and
nice.
He's really growing. He's growing fast. He's like 4 pounds heavier than he was 3 weeks ago when we got him.
Wow. So are you? Just kidding.
He's gonna be a big boy. Like we got him because he's supposed to be on the smaller end for his breed, but looking at the size of him and how fast he's growing, I'm like,
yeah, sweet though. That's nice. Yeah, good for you. Mate. Yeah, good for you.
But no, 70s. What do you got coming up this week, man?
Nothing special, just
we're just talking to a rock star,
Just talking to one of my all-time favorite singers. Tomorrow, and I know you're working really hard, mate, at work. Hopefully you'll get the chance. It is an hour later, so you might get the chance to.
Yeah, that might save me.
So tomorrow unless something goes badly wrong, and I've not heard anything from him to the contrary, tomorrow is Graham Bonnet is joining the show, and we're going to talk about what he's doing currently with the Graham Bonnet Band.
And
Lots of
he's worked
gigs.
with 3 of my favorite guitarists.
Yeah, and then we're going to go back and take a look at his career from right back to the 60s with his group, The Marbles, who had a couple of big hits in the 60s in the UK and Australia and places like that. And then forward through some of his early solo stuff, but then into the big stuff, Rainbow, MSG, Alcatraz, Impellitteri, who I actually love that Stand in Line album. It's a brilliant album. Anthem, Heavy Metal Anthem, one of my favorite albums. And then what he's doing today, obviously with the Graham Bonnet Band and all the gigs he's doing there. Lots of stuff to talk about. I've painstakingly produced clips that are not copyright inducing to play. Lots of images, a couple of fun things that hopefully he might get a laugh out of, either that or he'll rage quit the stream. No, it's just a couple of things dredged up from the past that you might find amusing. So hopefully a lot of fun. By all, I mean, if you watch Razor's stuff that he did about Alcatraz and his interview with Graham, he's a great guy, really good guy from all accounts. And some of the rock and roll rowdies that we work with know him and say he is a good Northeast English lad.
Yes.
So that should be a lot of fun. I hope you can make it, mate. Absolutely.
Yeah, I will absolutely be there if I can. And I may have to, beg my boss to let me go home. Like, hey, I agreed to this long before I worked here. So
you have to tell them that rock and roll needs you.
It's true.
I can't wait to talk about the Alcatraz stuff. And I mean, just to this day, that stands up so well. Those 80s Alcatraz albums, particularly the first 2. And then Assault Attack is a brilliant album. I'm debating whether to talk about the reason he was ejected or left Michael Schenker Group. His newly found love of naturism.
Yeah. That is a very polite way of putting that.
That's the way I'm going to put it if we talk about it. But that particular story. But we'll see.
I think we even talked about that on this stream when we covered Michael Schenker.
Yes, that's right. Shall we say that he enjoyed the fresh air?
Yeah.
But anyway, it's partly all that's in the past, because I do have clips of him at Michael Schenker Fest and with Michael Schenker playing stuff. I've got up-to-date clips with him with various artists.
They probably laugh about it now.
Oh, I think they do. Yeah, I think they do. I mean, it's egos at dawn with these guys in the 70s and 80s. Yeah. It's, the crossed swords and egos at dawn, I'm the bigger dick than you.
That's going to be a hell of an interview. Like,
literal
dick. Graham fucking Bonnet, man.
I know. And I've got my ticket from my Rainbow gig in 1980.
That's cool.
Ticket. Yeah, I'm going to show him that and say, can't help. I told him I'm going to be a fanboy. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no way not to.
That's right. It's going to happen. So
I had a hard enough time when we were talking to Razor. I mean,
I know, and hopefully Razor may join us tomorrow. I mean, obviously
cool.
he's a busy man, but he said he'd try and make it.
No, and as for me, the next thing you'll see on this channel, I don't know when, is the next Random Fandom. It was supposed to be this Thursday, but I got caught up at work. But the next Random Fandom we do whenever I get the chance to, will be Star Trek. I've already got the, kind of episode planned out, and it's one of my favorite fandoms of all time. So I figured right after my favorite, we'll get into that.
All right.
Because, I just have this habit of picking topics of just like, oh yeah, we'll just do a stream on Star Trek. What's the word? We'll get it all done in 2 hours.
Well, this is it. Never do we ever bite off more than we can chew.
No. Like my first one wasn't Warhammer 40K. Like a universe that people have dedicated entire channels worth of content to.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for having me, mate. It's been fun.
Absolutely. And thank you all for being here. This has been a great one, and we'll have to do it again real soon. But with that all being said, take care, stay safe. I love you all, and I'll catch you next time.